Well, it has certainly been a while. Let's talk about that. It may be going on a year since I've made the last lecture, and for that I sincerely apologize. There has been a lull in participation in the Academy, not only from students but faculty alike, and this is because the teachings of the tradition are living and breathing within us as a community and as individuals. As we all, both those who teach and those who receive the teachings, apply the teachings to their lives, they undergo profound transformation. And this is the same for a student as it is for a teacher, because if both are living the tradition, they will both experience profound changes. And as all things are connected, the academy, the student body, and the faculty together experienced highs and lows. As I imparted all of the wisdom and knowledge of the tradition onto students, they went out into the world and they made use of it, and the stories that they share about their successes and the profound changes in their lives are inspiring. But at the same time, I myself am living the tradition and also experience profound change and have ups and downs as a result. And the Academy is sort of the embodiment of all of that. It too has ups and downs, and it's been in a down because its people have been out there doing. So a lull in participation in the Academy means those who are involved are out there making it happen. And when the Academy is bustling with activity, with conversation, with communications between students, those people engaged in that activity are less doing and more discussing. They're not out there doing it. They're not busy. They're here. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when we're out there doing it, we have less time to commit to talking about doing it. That is not an excuse. That is a fact. I make no excuses for the fact that I have been less involved with the Academy. I offer only apologies rather than excuses. If I could have made it any other way, I would have, but not an excuse. It's sincere apology to those who feel that I have not been attentive enough. Certainly, I have not been. And so, there is a lot to be conveyed by this lecture. I, just before I made the lecture, sent out a group email to everyone registered with the Academy. Posted it to Facebook and also posted as a forum post-lecture. The parable of the raft, spoken by the Buddha. So I would refer you to that, and I would like everyone to contemplate it, as the majority of students who are worthy of initiation at this point are all coming into a phase when perhaps you spent the better part of a year or 2 or 3 immersed in the tradition, doing. You find yourself with less time to do the tradition because you're out there doing that which you desired to do in the first place. The tradition was a tool that enabled you, and now you're out there doing it. So I hear less and less from successful students. I hear less from them because they're out there doing. Parable of the raft. A man is trapped on one side of a river. He desperately needs to get to the other side. So he fashions a raft, and cuts trees and thatches leaves, and by his wits alone comes up with a tool, a vessel, that will carry him across the river to the other side. He's very proud of this achievement. And he mounts the raft, and he gets to the other side, and he disembarks, and he looks at the raft. The Buddha asks, would it make sense for the man to strap the raft to his back and carry it forward on his journey across land? After all, he put so much effort into it. He's so proud of it, and it served him so well for its purpose. Would this be appropriate? The Buddha asks. And the students say, certainly it would not. The raft has served its purpose. It's no longer necessary to cling to the raft. The Buddha says, would it be appropriate for the man to leave the raft, be grateful for his wits and wisdom, and for the raft itself, and understand that it no longer serves him? And the students say yes, that would be appropriate. The raft was a tool that served its purpose, and so is the tradition. It is a tool, and when it serves its purpose, the tool can be set aside. There are some of you who are new to the tradition, and you need to learn how to use the tool. And there are some who are seasoned and are familiar with the tools. In Freemasonry, that would be akin to a fellow craft, not quite an initiate, not quite a master. And then there are those students who are closer to mastery, and they're starting to feel that the tradition no longer serves them. Perhaps you're not getting out of the rituals and practices what you used to. They've become rote and dry. And then people begin to feel disenchanted with the tradition itself. And I ask you, if this describes you, to ask yourself, why is this so? Is it because you're out there doing and you've accomplished that which you set out to do? Do you still need the working tools? Another phrase we get from Freemasonry, the working tools. The tools build the building, the temple. And then we use the building and temple. And once the building and temple is built, we don't particularly need the tools anymore. We use that structure we have built, and the tradition is the tools, and that structure that we build is our lives. And we're out there doing and living. We may not need the tools as much. Sometimes we stumble, and then we find a hammer to drive that nail. And once we drive that nail, we set aside the hammer until we need it again, if we need it again. The tradition is a set of tools that enable you to accomplish that which you desire. But one should not live life for the tradition. One should not identify oneself by the tradition or as the tradition. As we see Wiccans out there who wear the black jewelry and clothing and dark makeup and eat, sleep, and breathe Wicca. And they're all about talking about and doing Wicca. They never actually manage to do much of anything else. If they're far too much about the tools, and they're missing the point that a tool is a implement that allows us to create something desirable. We don't live for the tradition. The tradition serves us as a tool. Its lessons become absorbed into who and what we are. And this leads me to the next subject, which is transformation, magical transformation, the definition thereof as reinventing oneself. Now, we've talked in the past about understanding and finding one's true nature and using that understanding of oneself to determine one's true purpose. which I hate to use that term specifically because it sounds very fatalistic, as if one is born with purpose. And that isn't so much the case. One is born with a nature. And the idea of finding one's purpose is to understand, based on what we know about our nature, what is appropriate for us in life, what is an appropriate path to take, rather than some destiny that is set before us. Transformation, magical transformation, as reinventing oneself. Well, magic is a dynamic process that never ends, and we have that term within the tradition, dynamic magic. It's not a spell that accomplishes something and then we have that and therefore the spell is no longer relevant. Dynamic magic is something that's always evolving, is always working, that is always being integrated and expanded upon and reshaped according to our needs, to our lives. Something that accompanies us on our journey. Something we do in life. It reflects what we are and makes us what we are. Now, magical transformation. There are old stories of enchanters changing themselves into various shapes, forms, animals, people. The tradition comes down to us as if these things are meant to be literal. But if we look at the theme of the myth, the idea that magic allows us to transform, isn't that why you joined the academy? Isn't there some change that you desired in life? So the practice of magic is magical transformation. And nothing in life is stagnant, so what we were yesterday is not what we are today. Dynamic. We are always moving, evolving, changing, transforming. And the idea of magical transformation is the ability of the magician, of the enchanter, of the sorcerer, to ride that wave, that dynamic wave of creation, that control one has over one's life and what one manifests in life to its utmost. Now compare the magical person to the average person who is born into a particular sort of a family and will make life decisions based on their experience in that family and will go forward and probably not be very different from the expectations that their family had for them and their children and so forth. They'll stay within a very narrow path. They don't transform all that much, but then think of the most successful people in the world who may be born to adverse conditions, yet take life to its absolute limits, who become the leaders, the superstars. This is transformation. They certainly weren't born that way. Some are, but let's consider those who were not. Transformation through intention, through discipline, through sheer desire to be something they are not presently. They will grow into that goal. And so we reinvent ourselves all the time. We're always in a process of reinvention. We're always shape-shifting from one thing to the next. And it took me many decades to understand this, that it is my nature to be so. And it may be someone else's nature to be quite ordinary or the same or consistent throughout their lives. And they may be very happy as such. They may be very magical people at the same time. But generally, very magical people reinvent, create, recreate, regenerate. They shapeshift. They have many lives in one. For the longest time, I considered myself a failure in life because I always said the old, I believe it was Ben Franklin, the saying, master of, or jack of all trades, I should say, jack of all trades, master of none. I desperately wanted to be master of one, just one. All those people who were able to see their way through college and university and had set out to be archaeologists or anthropologists or doctors or whatever, and consistency, and landed there and were the master of their trade. Well, people would say to me, oh, you're a jack of all trades, you can do anything, you know everything, and that was true, but no pride in that. I felt like, yes, a jack of all trades, I can do a little of everything, I know a little of everything, but mastered none. And it occurred to me in really exploring the nature of myself that is my gift, that is my nature, and it allows me to be the person that I am. It allows me to be your mentor, your instructor, because no one in the world could have done it. I'm the only one that could. And that's why I'm here doing it. No one else did, because it wasn't their nature. And that applies to us all. We're all doing, if we're working within the scope of our nature, we're all doing what we're best at. And I'm best at transformation, reinventing myself. It's how I experience life to its fullest. We will follow up this lecture with a live class. We'll attach a live class, and I hope to bring in all of the original students of the online academy, and perhaps some founding members, if possible, to come in and guess what my life is like now, a year later, compared to what it was last we checked with each other, when last I checked in. And no one will guess what I've been up to. I couldn't have guessed, could not have guessed the degree of change, the degree of transformation, yet again, that I've experienced in my life. And I look back and I've been so many things and so many people, and I realize that is my nature, that I resisted for so long. And I think so many students resist their natures because they feel they should be doing fill in the blank. I should have been a PhD. I should have been a doctor. I should have done this. I should have done that. If you're a jack of all trades, you'll never be a master of one. If you're a master of a trade, you'll never know much beyond that. That is your forte. You have the inability to be the jack of all trades that someone else may be. So we have to own who we are. Be okay with it. Then the doors open up before us. The fifth secret. I did not intend to discuss this in a lecture that could be referenced by a student of any degree along the path of whether they're beginner, intermediate, advanced, and so forth. But it occurs to me, the neophyte, the beginner, couldn't begin to comprehend anything I'm about to say, and those who are sort of in the middle path stand to sort of connect the dots a bit, and those who have achieved or are close to mastery will have the epiphany, or already have. So there's nothing to lose by just getting it out there. The fifth secret. Why is it called the fifth secret? Well, if you really want to know, then your student project is to go figure out what the first four secrets were. What are the profound secrets of the tradition? If you care. If you don't, it means nothing to me. It's called the fifth secret. That's all that matters. But it is the fifth and final. So, what does it mean? The beginner in the tradition is instructed to build an altar. In the Missal, we describe the altar as a typical workspace. Particular symbols are present. It facilitates the ritual, and particularly the renunciation. Students wonder, well, why am I doing all this? What purpose does any of that serve? And there are contentious symbols in the renunciation and the rites themselves and the altar and so forth, and purposely. It's very obvious that these are contentious symbols. These are designed to elicit emotional and psychological responses. They're designed to elicit questions, profound questions. And that they also serve to weed out or prevent those who are just incapable of asking such questions. We don't want them. And those who are thoroughly spooked by these symbols, these questions, will tread no farther. So these symbols, these ideas, serve many a purpose. The prominent icon on the working altar is the inverted cross. People will say to me, why is it present? Why are we doing that? Why should that have anything to do with what we do? Well, these are the questions that you need to answer. These are the questions that you need to come face to face with and understand, well, it's there for a reason. It's obviously not arbitrary. Why? And then the rest of the tradition sort of becomes a temper tantrum in rebellion against the man, against the church, against the pious, against everything we've been told we had to believe. And you sit on that for a year or so, or 3, or 4, or 5. The cross is inverted. Everything we're taught is the whole purpose of the tradition is resistance and rebellion. We're pushing away these ideas that limit our understanding and our thinking about what it is to be alive, what it is to exist. We're pushing away, we're fighting words like rebellion, renunciation, defiance. Defined the tradition. But what when we reach the other shore? What purpose do those tools then serve? One of the founders of the Academy comes from a Quaker background, as do I. We had many a debate as to how relevant the ideals of Quakerism were to the tradition as it is today, and my argument had always been that without that element, there is no point to the tradition. For those that are unaware, Quakerism is originally a dissenter form of Christianity that was actually very one of the early sort of super ultra pious religious groups. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, which was a Quaker colony, the original Quaker colony. And at one time, much of Pennsylvania's citizens were Quakers. There are very, very few now, and there are very few Quakers anywhere. But Quaker witchcraft was a thing, and where I grew up, we would dig in the garden or just dig in the dirt, and we would find amulets and talismans, Quaker amulets, talismans, witch bottles, and clay slabs and so forth, and not deep beneath the surface, because it was a prominent part of Quaker life not 100 years ago. Which was ironic, because as an ultra-pious sort of ridiculously superstitious group of dissenting Christians, they spent a lot of time practicing witchcraft for the purpose of avoiding being affected by witchcraft. So they condemned witchcraft, and one shouldn't do it, but they practiced a hell of a lot of it to prevent its effects on them. One of those catch-22s of history. And there were few within the community that understood the nature of why this is happening, what's going on. So the Academy begins with that foundation, and the reason the Academy was called Heritage originally is because of the strong Quaker foundation that we intended to convey in the teachings. And ultimately, we decided that we would stick more with the medieval interpretations before the Enlightenment. That is a key word, before the Enlightenment. Now, Quakerism started out as a really hoity-toity, charismatic sort of Christian group, anti-Catholic group, called Quakers because it was noted that they shook before the Word of God, literally quaked during their ministries and so forth. Pretty superstitious, pretty religious people. However, today, Quakers are of the most progressive Christians who are very involved in human rights, and many Quaker groups, known as meetings, don't even use the word God anymore because they're not exactly sure what the hell God would be, but they're all trying to figure that out for themselves. So it's actually one of the most progressive, least pious Christian denominations of the day. What survives of it? But a fundamental Quaker idea was George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, understood that what he called the light, the indwelling light, period, existed in every person. Sometimes it was very dim, sometimes it was very bright, but the indwelling light, he called it. And that can be expanded to say the light of God, the light of Christ, and so forth. But the idea that Christ is something that is natural, that is inborn, and dwelling in every person. Very similar to the Buddhist philosophy that everyone is a potential Buddha. Everyone is potentially Buddha. In Quakerism, everyone is potentially carrying around the spark of God, the indwelling light. And this descent during the Reformation was based on the idea that the priesthood and the church did not represent, was not the voice and mouth of God, that God was within us. We didn't need that, the Catholic Church and so forth. That access to the divine was inside. And it could be kindled to a great fire. And it could be ignored and even snuffed out. But the potential was there in every man, every woman. As a sideline, and it's been mentioned many times, that the very graphic iconography of a witch with the pointy hat and the buckled shoes and so forth comes from Quaker women who very much dressed that way long after it had fallen out of fashion. Quaker women still look this way, and so Quakers were accused of witchcraft by other Christian denominations and very hated for the way they practiced their religion and so forth. And eventually we get that traditional witch concept, what a witch looks like, the Wicked Witch of the West, comes from depictions of Quaker women performing ministry, vocal ministry. Very tied to the tradition. Until the fifth secret, until one achieves mastery, the cross is inverted on the altar. We are turning upside down everything we've been taught, everything we've been told. Why? Something is backward. This is what the Quakers were saying in the first place. Something is wrong with this picture, this priesthood, this church. Something's wrong. It's all upside down. It's all ass backward. This is what we're saying about the concepts of piety that we're brought up with. It's all ass backward, and the inverted cross represents that. We realize through our stumbling through the thickets and dark forest that is the teachings of the tradition, as we press on ever toward some light, that there is a reason, there is a purpose. And if you're living the tradition for the sake of living the tradition, you never leave the forest. We seek light. Also a Masonic term. Where is the light? The devil of the tradition is the dark forest. The fairy queen of the tradition is the promise of light. She is all that is good that we create in our minds by reason. She's wisdom. She's beauty. She is compassion. She is all the things that make us human animals. As animals, the devil; as human, the fairy queen. She is grace. She exists within. Because those things, beauty and compassion, these aren't human inventions. These are things we choose. These are things that occur in our minds that we recognize as people. But animals do not. It is something indwelling. Our ancestors who inverted the cross on the altar and defined themselves as witches were rallying against the church. And their point was not how wrong the church was. Their point was the light is not there. The light is in here. The purpose of the tradition is not to mock the structure of the church and piety and social righteousness. It is to recognize that those things are inappropriate and not consistent with a dynamic, fully lived, deliberate life. They are barriers. The fifth secret is that Christ was not the church. The idea of Christ is within, is a light that burns within that can be cultivated, like in the Bible. And as Quakers saw it, Quakers, particularly, and God's people as they saw it, were capable of great miracles because Jesus was capable of great miracles. He healed the sick, the blind, brought the dead back to life. danced with the devil. And how so? Because he was the teacher who understood we are all the Son of God. Not just him. He's the model. He had the indwelling light. And he shared the indwelling light with all of his believers. And therefore, Quakers had the indwelling light. And early Quakers believed they could heal the sick and raise the dead. And all the things Jesus could do, he taught them to do because they believed it was encoded there in the Bible. Jesus isn't saying, believe in me and you'll have salvation. He's saying, do as I do, and you can do as I do. That was the Quaker message. They were the first lunatics running around trying to perform miracles. But they got it right, because they freed themselves from that structure of the church that witchcraft was trying to break away from. They freed themselves and said, this is something is backward and upside down and wrong, and we know instinctively we are right. We know that we don't need that to get where we want to be because it's within. Our ancestors of the Middle Ages believed, and this is the fifth secret, that they were the legitimate church. They were not the enemy of the church. Their enemies were the enemy of the true church, and they were performing the true Mass. They were the true people of God. Now, we argue what God means and so forth, because they had that indwelling light. And whether they called it God or otherwise, they understood the power of existence, of determinate living, of setting one's own stars, plotting one's own course, came from within. It was not something one was born into, a fate. It was not something that God had predetermined at your birth. And that your life was not bound to God's will, that you are God's will. And it lives in you. It expresses itself through you. When we crush the Eucharist, we are defying that model of church, that idea that God is out there, and saying that all we need really to be whole and complete is in here, God or not. But make no mistake, those so-called witches who gathered together to do as they did believed wholly and truly, as the Quakers did, that they were the true church. And in the mastery of the tradition, the cross is set right. And the Eucharist is no longer crushed, but consumed, because we actively now partake of the wisdom that the tradition bestows on us. We have fed the tradition with offerings of grain. And now we reap the benefits of that which we sow. We consume the Eucharist because we are the priest. The Eucharist had been stolen in the Middle Ages, had needed to be stolen from the church. Not to tick off the priests, but because it was rightfully, it was the rightful property of the people. And those people who thought they were the true church. How dare the arrogant priesthood have this? This belongs to us. And now that we understand it, we partake of it. And what are we celebrating when we do this? We're reaping the benefits of the wisdom of the tradition. We are now partaking and drinking, consuming, literally, the Spirit. It is a communion with being itself. It is full circle from the offering of grain to the consumption. We offer physical grain. We receive spiritual. There is a missal for masters of the tradition for the true and final Mass. Those who come through the tradition find themselves at about a year or two where they just feel like, I just don't get it anymore. It's just not the rush, the adrenaline of the edginess and the sheer excitement of it all gets old. And one wonders what was the point. Oh, that's normal. Because you're past all of that. You've gotten to the other side of the river and you're looking at your raft and saying, this was cool and everything, but it's really heavy, and I don't know if I need to keep carrying this across land. It's time for that particular student to write the cross on its base and partake of the Eucharist, because now, rather than rejection, we are celebrating, we are indulging that which we have cultivated within ourselves. This light, this ability to pilot our own destiny, the spiritual self that we have developed, this lighthouse, this beacon. We become Christ if we're to use the terminology of our ancestors. And make no mistake, every witch believed they knew Christ. And it isn't the Christ of the church, and it isn't good terminology for today, but even Quakers have done away with that terminology and the indwelling light. They know the light within. And in its time, and in the Middle Ages, they were talking about, we are the church. We represent the light of Christ. Christ is present within us as the church, not them as the church. We are enlightened beings. We upright the cross on its base, and we partake of the Eucharist and the wine. We are reaping the benefits of wisdom. We are celebrating life. We are celebrating getting to the other side of the river where we intended to be in the first place, and letting go of the tools that got us there, lest they bind us ashore. We let go. We enjoy the bread, because now we deserve it. We understand it, its meaning and its value. And then what does the upright cross represent? Balance. The restoration of that which is good. Justice. Reference the card in the tarot deck, the Hanged Man. We upright the cross, undoing the Hanged Man. Reference that card. Do your research. The fifth secret is the light that we have shunned. We discover was within us all of the time. This is why we're out there doing, instead of inside talking. I have students who have come so far. And people will say to me, oh, what's so, Wiccan will say, oh, well, what is there? It reminds me of, I'm involved in martial arts, and it reminds me of, let's talk about what belt you are. And the Wiccans will say, well, what makes them so advanced students? What kind of magic do they do? Do they know herbalism? What are they doing, moon magic and the nonsense? No. An almost graduate in biology has become a professional musician. A student who came into the tradition with trepidation now runs a New Age occult store successfully. A student who came into the tradition lost, without direction, in poor physical health, has completely turned her life over and is the happiest person you can imagine, and annoyingly so, I must say, because we should all be so happy. Myself, you couldn't begin to guess what my life is like today, what I do for a living, what the people who surround me. I'd like you to try, though. It will be fun. People will say, good Lord, where do you get the time? But it isn't about time. It's about reinventing oneself and following that dynamic flow. Not being afraid to be your nature. Not getting hung up on yourself, your regrets, your fears, your expectations. Completely different life. If I've left anyone out, I don't mention names, but I do like to use student successes as an example because I see so much change in people. And it's when I hear less from them that I know they're out there doing instead of here talking. And then when I hear from them, they tell me how remarkably different their life has been because of the tradition. Do they carry the raft on their backs? No. But they know where they parked it. Should you need us? So I say to you, in what may be this final lecture that the tradition has to offer, the Academy has to offer, be who you are and do not trip on your tools. It has been a privilege beyond words to be your instructor, to pass on to you the knowledge and wisdom that I've gained. And I think it will be many years before I fully appreciate that, the depth of that, of this experience. And I sincerely thank you for the opportunity to do so. Best wishes, my friends.